Hello and welcome to this video on what is involved in making a better quality sake. If you buy sake, there is a reasonable chance you won't see many options. The choices you can make will be unlikely to have much effect. There will be differences in taste, but the actual quality will be reasonably consistent. Where you have a wider selection, the impact of choice can be much more significant. The reason is simple. Sake comes in different grades. Where you have a limited choice, there may be between the lowest grade and maybe a middle quality sake. A better selection can have everything from middle grade to the best. The question now is what makes the difference? For this video we will limit ourselves to just 8 of the most common kinds of sake, these being Ginjo, which is a basic level rice wine, and made with a longer and higher temperature fermentation. It also has alcohol added. Daiginjo, which is like Ginjo, but the rice is more polished, which we'll explain more on later. Junmai, which is like Ginjo and Daiginjo, but it has no alcohol added. The rice can also be of any quality, as typically they're not very specific about the details on the labeling. Junmai Ginjo continues with the trend of not including alcohol. However, it does specify the degree of rice polishing, or at least the name does, with up to 40% of the original rice grain milled or polished away. Junmai Daiginjo is like Junmai Ginjo, but up to half the rice grain is removed. These are the major, let's say, common commercial varieties of sake, but there are still some you may see, and while less related to quality, there is still a significant amount of overlap with the quality of what you get. The first is Tokubetsu Junmai. Now this takes the idea of sake and basically means the brewery's done something different. It's not really anything particularly different from regular Junmai, and in fact, it may not even be that, it may be similar to Daiginjo. It also does, however, mean that they can be using all kinds of rice, particularly rice grain quality, the type, and more in what they've done. The Tokubetsu part of this name basically means that they've done something unique and different. Honjozo, which is where the brewer's alcohol is added, and this is in many respects similar to Ginjo. However, what is different between the two is that the rice itself is generally polished to a much lower degree. And then we have the Tokubetsu Honjunzo. This is fundamentally alcohol added to the sake, but unlike the Honjunzo where you have the brewer's alcohol added and the polishing at 70%, in this case it's 60% or less in many cases. Okay, with this summary of the sake styles out of the way and the details not yet clear, let's get on to the effect it does have on the quality of the sake. The first is the recurrent reference to rice polishing or milling. The basic idea is simply a more extreme version of the method used in turning raw or whole rice from the field into eating rice. You would see this with brown rice that still has some of the kernel attached, and white rice, which has all of the bran removed. This leaves behind the inner starchy part of the rice grain, but removes all the external rice grain. The effect of removing most, if not all, of the bran and a large portion of the starch is similar to using pure sugar, or at least simple sugars, such as sucrose or even glucose in brewing ethanol. A yeast can more easily convert this into ethanol. However, sake does not just use yeast. This means that you can convert the starch of the rice into glucose using aspergillus much sooner, much more easily, and much more effectively. Arguably, and this is a slight point of contention, the more pure the starch, in terms of the more milled the rice grain, the more quickly the aspergillus works into and more easily the aspergillus will affect the grain. This is because there is a greater surface area, at least relative to the volume, and therefore penetrations occur more easily and conversion occurs much sooner. This should reduce the time the aspergillus takes to impart flavor before the yeast is added. The combination of little to no bran, the shorter time for aspergillus to work and impart flavor and refined flavor, as only certain aromatic flavors are present as a result, means the more milled the rice is, the less pronounced flavors and aromas should be. This is true generally speaking. the more whole grain and the longer the time for the aspergillus to work, the more, let's say, extra flavors can be generated. It also means a longer time frame for, let's say, a lot more mess to be made of the palate and aroma. That's because the process of fermentation creates a lot more competing flavors and aromas, whereas with less time, there are fewer aromas and flavors that will be competing with each other and are arguably more complementary, or at least less pronounced. This means that the end result is more nuanced. If you want more details on the exact process of milling, we have a video in the top right corner of this video, along with the effects that various proteins and other products have. And now for the addition of alcohol. For the most part, breweries are either going to add pure ethanol or existing sake they have already produced. Both of these have strengths and weaknesses. First, we have pure ethanol. This will achieve several outcomes. First of all, they're going to make the aroma and the flavor accessible, but also it's going to stress the yeast into ethanol production that much sooner. Now, with ethanol, we have a similar effect to what it has on bread making, for instance. That is, it makes the aromas and flavor more soluble and therefore accessible when you consume it. This effectively has the result of improving the flavor and aroma of the sake. The other effect, as mentioned, is that yeast is mildly stressed and therefore primed to produce ethanol. This leads to production of not just aromatics and flavor molecules, but ethanol as well. It is similar in some respects to how ale or lager yeast produces somewhat unique flavors based on the temperature, but in this case it's due to the ethanol instead. The addition of existing sake, or sake that's already been made and processed, has much of the same effect. However, unlike pure ethanol, it already has some of the flavors and aromas present. Think of it as kind of like a booster to the initial flavor, but it doesn't add any unwanted or unexpected flavors. It is in a manner of speaking like adding whiskey during blending. If you're using an existing older batch, so essentially not a single malt, you're going to find that there's a lot more variability, or at least you can add more variability. Next we have the type of rice. Now, rice is going to be a major element to this, and understand this video is not dedicated only to that, but understand it is very important. There is a standard type of rice used for making sake, and it is a short-grained Japanese rice. It's properly called japonica rice. What makes japonica special is the large starchy core. Within the japonica rice, there are two groups used for sake specifically. These are your shuzo kotomakai and several varieties of table rice or eating rice. This includes koshikari and hitamembore. These two groups tend to be used, partly because they are readily available, but also they produce reliable results, let's say. Of these two, table rice is less reliable in some respects as, well, it's developed for eating, not for brewing. But you find that people who are using eating rice for making sake generally aren't doing it as a commercial endeavor. Rather, it's being, let's be blunt about it, they're basically home brewers. Of course, you don't have to be limited to rice specific to sake to be able to use rice, and this is one of those things where the, let's say, more creative or craft breweries might come into play, particularly those that are making togubetsu type sake. The type of rice you can make, or let's say use for this, is interesting in and of itself. There are, of course, alien varieties that get used, and these tend to be produced in a very small volume, at least relative to any of the others that are out there. In some cases, it can have a market share of up to 10% compared to mainstream rice varieties, but in fact, there are quite a few that are much smaller again, mostly because they're used for regional specialities, certainly not in terms of the global scheme of rice production. Going even further from the core of sake, you can use other short-grain rice. An extreme example is arborio rice. This is an Italian rice that is grown and primarily used for risotto. There are also short-grain rice varieties grown specifically in Spain and Korea too. So it's not just Japanese rice or japonica that can be used. Something that has not been mentioned but is kind of important is what part of the fermentation you have. There are two general classifications. It's the supernatant, or the part of the sake that is free-floating above the rice, koji, and yeast mixture. The other is the pressed or lees that are a much stronger flavour, but also, if they're used like this, produce a hazy sake. This is the kind that will often be produced by a household, for instance, when they're home brewing. But even on a commercial scale, the lees can be pressed as a separate and generally considered inferior product, or at least inferior to the clean and clear sake made from the, let's say, a pure supernatant, or at least pure by comparison. Some brewers may also blend these two to some extent, and this is for a very good reason. The lees will be responsible for producing a lot of the stronger, more bold flavours, whereas the supernatant, so to say, is more likely to be a lighter, more fresh flavours, let's say. Lastly, we have the fermentation tank style. Now this might seem like an odd thing, but it can be kind of important because it will alter how everything behaves altogether. You have what is basically the traditional style of a sake fermenter, and this is simply a cylinder. The most traditional is just a wooden or bamboo bucket that is a flat-walled and bottomed bucket, sealed with a flat lid. Of course, modern technology and engineering lets breweries be much more creative. The most basic variation is going to be a tank that is straight-walled and tilted towards the bottom, where it tapers in like a cone. This would be similar, if not the same, as what is used in beer brewing. The amount of sedimentation and lees available for the sake to ferment and to produce flavours will be dictated by the vessel design and choice. A straight-walled vessel will be consistent throughout the fermentation, and importantly will allow for those lees to be pressed, extracting more of the more strongly flavoured parts. Whereas you have a tapered vessel, and this will change over time as the surface changes over time, with the different geometry of the vessel itself, but also it can be more challenging to extract the lees and extract the flavour, at least the more flavoured elements of it from this. Further to that, you may also find that the same lees can be used to make amazake or sweet sake, and even shochu or the distilled sake. This is how you get different qualities, of course. Some of it is simply how polished the rice is. Generally speaking, the more polished, the superior the quality of sake it will make. Sometimes it's a matter of additional ingredients, like alcohol. In other cases, it can be influenced by a far more seemingly superficial thing, like the fermentation tank design. And then there are obvious changes, like the choice of rice. After all, if you change the very nationality of the rice, can it still really be called sake? Thank you for watching this video. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.